In 1988, I rented an old wooden house with my then wife. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was awakened by a very creepy noise which would alternate from a loud, irregular chanting to an almost whisper-like eerie hiss. It was like nothing I had ever heard. The hair on the back of my non-believer neck stood completely on end. Frankly, I was freaking the F out and questioning my denial of the supernatural. I urgently woke up my wife, but communicated to her to say nothing and just listen. I wanted to make sure I wasn't imagining the whole thing or dreaming. In just a few seconds, her eyes grew as large as saucers, and I received my answer. She clearly heard it too, and was so terrified that she wasn't even able to speak at first. Finally, she summoned the courage to whisper to me, "What is that?" I shook my head in bewilderment. I had no explanation to give. The inhuman whisper didn't seem to be bothered at all by our awareness of it, and only the thundering beat of my heart partially drowned it out. It was very close to us, sounded less than 3 feet away. And, as the man of the house, I was expected to investigate what it was. The hiss was actually coming from underneath our bed. Specifically, directly under my side. I didn't have a bedside table or a lamp, so the only way to turn on a light was to get up and walk over to the wall switch in the dark. You can probably understand why I was hesitant, to say the least. A little light did filter in from the street light across the road through our curtain window, but it wasn't very much, and not nearly enough to make me feel brave enough to investigate. Worse still, the ungodly whispering continued on, unabated. With courage, I finally dredged up from somewhere I'll never know. I leaned over and peered underneath the bed to confront the unknown source of terror. Slowly, my eyes adjusted to the near total darkness under the bed, and I made out what was haunting us. A little backstory. Each night we carried a glass jug of water to bed with us, so we didn't have to get up and go to the kitchen for a drink. To give you a full picture, it's one of those half-gallon sized orange juice jars with a metal lid. I quickly surmised that the hiss and chanting was actually coming from the darn possessed jug. Trapped air was escaping out of the partially screwed on lid. After realizing that our chanting ghost was actually just escaping air from a water jug, we had a good little laugh, but it made me realize just how brittle my disbeliever courage was. Less than a month later, I found myself with a nearly identical repeat of the situation, except I knew for a fact that we hadn't brought the water jug to bed with us. This time, the hissing was different and sounded like a feral animal on the attack. And we don't have any pets. Again, I awoke my wife. She listened and heard the same close-by screeching, hissing noise that I did. I didn't have to remind her that we left the water jug in the fridge. She remembered that too. We both stared at each other in the dark. The noise was angry and threatening. It was almost like a series of guttural growls and fiery hissing. This time, it seemed to be a little further away than the first time, but still incredibly close. I pulled back the curtain and looked outside. Nothing. My heart raced. It was definitely coming from right outside the window, and yet, there was nothing I could see out there. The streetlight lit up the yard well enough to even see individual blades of grass, and yet, the unexplained hissing continued. Finally, I stood up and put my face against the glass. When I peered down as sharply as I could, I was able to solve the mystery. 2 or 3 cats had cornered an opossum, and they were all having a hissing match near the side of my house. Only by looking directly down at an acute angle I could see them. In the dark, in the sterile stillness of night, little unexplained things can seem like big unexplained things. Hello there. If you're enjoying the content, then please whisper into the like button's ear that you cannot stand the sound of their music, and then wish them luck on their 6-month musical tour. Also, throw the subscribe button a case of beer, preferably Pabst Blue Ribbon. Alright, back to the stories. I remember it vividly. I was around 9 years old. Both my parents worked days, and my brother and I were homeschooled. My brother was asleep in the basement. My dad was already at work. I was watching Looney Tunes, and my mom was about to leave for work. After the door shut, I go to the den window next to the driveway and wave goodbye. A little habit I had at that age. After she started pulling out of the driveway, I ran to her bedroom window to continue to wave goodbye. I usually would leave and continue on to watch cartoons after seeing the old truck pass between the trees, but I was stopped. I started to hear a heavy breathing. I stood there, against the space heater under the window, trying to comprehend what I was hearing. As cheesy as it sounds, the demonic breathing came from under the bed. I tried to muster up the courage to look under the bed, but could not. I stood there for 2.5 hours, occasionally getting on my knees to ante up the courage to look, but always ended up on the space heater again. After so much time had passed, I heard a deep voice say, "Ugh, I don't have time for this." And the breathing stopped. I stay still on the space heater for another 10 minutes when my brother comes up. I still say and do nothing, but he looks around for me and checks my parents' room. "What are you doing?" he asks. I explain everything, and he shrugs it off as my imagination. I tell my mother this when she comes home, and she says it was probably my brother playing a trick on me. Though at that age, my mother and I were aware that the house was haunted, but she didn't want to freak me out. All else I can say, I never waved goodbye to my mom again after that. Around last year, I was lying in my bed at like 3 a.m. I was on my phone texting someone, and didn't know how to spell a long word starting with P. I can't remember the word, but for the story's sake, let's say it was pretty. I say the word into the microphone, and it doesn't go in, so I say it again. This time it goes in, but a second later, I hear the word pretty come from under my bed in a demonic voice, as if it was mocking me. I freeze, and don't move for at least a minute, petrified of the sound I just heard. I finally text my boyfriend at the time, who happens to be awake, and call him. I put the phone under the bed whilst on FaceTime with him. He says he saw nothing, so I ended up staying on call with him all night because I was too scared to sleep. The next morning I tell my mom, but she says it's my phone messing up. But she's just saying that so I'm not scared. But really, I know there was something under there. Both of these stories happened years ago, when I was young. Since it's much shorter, I'll start with the bed story. I was in maybe first grade when this happened. On this night, I was laying in my parents' bed watching TV. My parents were in the living room at the time. As I was watching one of my favorite shows, out of nowhere, their bed started shaking, and I heard what sounded like someone growling under the bed. I jumped out of bed immediately and ran to my parents. They told me it was probably nothing. When we went and looked under the bed, nothing was there. I'm still not sure what caused it. The doppelganger is one of my favorite stories, and I still don't have an explanation for it. Two of my closest friends when I was a kid were twins. They lived closer to the outskirts of our town, and there was a dirt road right by their house that we liked to walk down. Also slightly relevant to this story, there were two houses next to theirs that were further down a dirt road. One house was their grandma's and the other was their uncle's. One day, we went to go for a walk, but shortly after starting, my friends decided they wanted to make sure it was okay with their dad. Instead of all of us going, one of the twins went back to ask, and then she was supposed to come and tell us the answer. After what felt like way too long, we finally saw her walking down the road. We were just watching her, but for some reason when she reached the driveway for her uncle's house, she turned like she was going to walk down the driveway. Her sister and I was extremely confused. She had no reason to be going there. Maybe about 2 or 3 minutes later, we saw her walking down the road again. At this point, we started running towards her. We were fairly close when she turned down her uncle's driveway again. Literally seconds after she turned, we reached the driveway and she was nowhere to be seen. We kept running all the way to their house and didn't see her once. When we reached the house, we found her sitting in their room. She had decided to wait for us to get bored and come back, because her dad said no to the walk. There was absolutely no way for her to have turned down the driveway, make it all the way back to their house without either me or her sister seeing her running for the house. Whenever I was a young kid, my older brother and I had bunk beds. My brother had the bottom and I had the top. Usually, I didn't have any problems with the top bunk, but my brother swore he heard something breathing underneath his bed. My mom checked it out and confirmed there was nothing under the bed. My brother continued hearing the breathing, even though there was nothing under the bed. He even tested to see if it was his breathing, so he breathed and then abruptly stopped. Sure enough, the breathing continued a second later. This terrified my brother, and me too. He checked under the bed but saw nothing. A few years later, my brother went to live with his dad for a bit. So I had the bottom bunk, and my little brother had the top bunk. Just like my older brother, I heard the same breathing. The same thing happened. My mom checked and saw nothing, and I laid in bed terrified. It went away and came back every few days. I lived with it until I moved a year or two later. To this day, I don't know if it was a ghost, a demon, or a person. This strange incident happened around 20 years ago, when I was 18 and in high school. As for context, I'm from Germany. Our school system is divided into 3 different types after elementary school ends with 4th grade. Gymnasium, and no, it's not a sports school. It's a school type where you can go to university after graduating. In the last 2 years of gymnasium, we chose 2 main subjects to focus on, and, in the end, write our graduation exam about. One of my subjects was German. The class was normally smaller, with around 15 students max, and our teacher stays with us for 2 years, preparing us for graduation in the particular subject. All the students in our German class got along very well with each other. They were all aged around 18 and 19, and we also liked our teacher, who was about a 35-year-old female. We liked her a lot, and the feeling was mutual. It was always a very friendly, calm, relaxed environment, which prompted us to go on something like a weekend trip to a hostel, like a month before the final graduation exam. We did this to repeat all the topics from the last 2 years, prepare for any upcoming questions or topics in the exam, and just generally strengthen our knowledge on the subject. Such trips are not a common thing to do, but we did it just because we studied in a very familiar environment, and it felt like a little goodbye to our school since it would be all over soon. There was no pressure to go, so whoever wanted to go went, and whoever didn't want to go, they stayed home. Since we were all still high schoolers, we picked a hostel that wasn't far away from our home, maybe about an hour or so. And of course, it wasn't anything too fancy, just your average everyday setup. I can't remember so well anymore, but it was somewhere located in a smaller village. The hostel itself was isolated and surrounded by some woods. That's all fine and dandy for a hostel, since people mostly use it for sleepovers when they go hiking, or they book rooms for seminars and group talks. Because we wanted to save money, all the females slept together in one room, along with the teacher. Everyone was fine with it. I don't know how it's today, but at that time, it wasn't a big deal. We weren't minors, and it was just one night. It was a bit crowded, but hey, we saved a lot of money. This detail is a little fuzzy, but I think there were 5 to 6 people in the room. One of them was my best friend at the time. Some of the beds were foldable, so you can fold them up and take them into other rooms if you want it, or need it. The beds were quite close to each other, so there wasn't a lot of walking room inside the cramped space. The night was calm. I remember I slept perfectly fine. Normally, I am an early bird, but when I woke up, it wasn't dark anymore. So the room was dim because the curtains were pulled in front of the windows. It seemed the others were still asleep. At least, everyone was still laying in their beds, not moving. This was a time where there were no smartphones and no internet, so there was no chance someone was just browsing. Since I needed to use the restroom, I silently left the room, not wanting to wake the others. It's common, or was common, that there were no toilets or showers in the room itself, so you had to go to the separate one outside in the hallway. I came back, and some of the others were already awake, sitting on their beds, maybe a bit groggy. Silently admitting it is always a bit weird waking up with others, we just greeted each other good morning, and that was it as far as first interaction. Everybody was just minding their own business. And then I realized that there was an extremely weird, almost black, dark brown, red isolated circular spot on the ground, between me and my bestie's bed. I was puzzled and couldn't tell the exact size, but I would say it was around 5 to 7 centimeters wide. It wasn't extremely big, but it also wasn't so small that I wouldn't have realized it in the evening before we went to sleep. It was shiny, not crusted too, which means it wasn't something dry. I didn't touch it, but it looked thick. No one could see through it, and there were no crumbs or grains, nor anything chunky inside. It looked purely liquid. The floor had a grayish color to it, so there was a strong difference in colors. That's also why I spotted it immediately. The strangest thing about it was the very circular shape. No smearing, no other stain nearby, no droplets. It's almost like when you let honey drip on an even surface, or something of that nature, but this wasn't honey for sure. Honestly, at the time, it looked to me like it appeared right out of the floor, because it had no drops or anything. You know when you see a movie and the blood is oozing out of the wooden floor through a thin crack? It's just like that. It's just that our floor was linoleum. so there was no way it could ooze from the floor. There were no gaps. I told my bestie, and she was puzzled as well. Then I told the others. Everyone looked at it. Everyone started looking at it and began to get weirded out. Our teacher too. The way she looked at us was like searching for an answer as to who maybe did it, or if someone would know where it came from. Then I looked up at the ceiling, wondering if something was dripping from there. But again, there were no droplets around, which is something you would see whenever liquid falls from the roof. And there was also no stain on the ceiling either. My second guess was, since there were so many females in the room, maybe one of them were on their period. Naturally, I had suspected my bestie, since the stain was between our bed and I wasn't on my period. I thought to myself, come on, it happens. We don't have to make this a big deal. But then I started thinking, even if this was menstrual blood, how the heck was it so isolated, so clean with no stains around it or any smearing? And it was really thick, dark, and big. I started to reason that it is physically impossible for someone on their period to leave such a stain like that. The more I thought about it, the more I understood that it is impossible to leave a stain like that without any other accompanying stains. Also, menstrual cups weren't a thing at that time, so it wasn't possible that someone just emptied a cup there, and why would they even do that? So gross. Then I started thinking about it being a bloody nose, but then I started going down the same reasoning train as the menstrual blood. There would definitely be smaller droplets somewhere around the pool, or at the very least, somebody would own up to it, because there's nothing embarrassing about a bloody nose. It is very natural. Then I started thinking if there was a smaller animal somewhere in the hostel, like maybe a mouse, or a wounded possum or fox. That thought didn't last very long in my head, because there was no way for the animal to get inside the hostel, and there were no smears of blood around. Plus, if the animal was injured, we would have found it because of how big the blood spot was. It would have lost so much blood that it needed to rest somewhere. All of us were very confused. And since I am a very rational person, my assumption was menstrual blood, because it was the most logical thing I could think of. Even if that answer was somewhat irrational, I had to cling to it because it was the only logical answer I could come up with. As for the others, they believed it was some strange liquid that somebody spilled the night before. I didn't buy it, but since everyone else was agreeing to it, I just went along with them. In truth, the spots made absolutely no sense.